real because Facebook does this weird thing that you feel like you've seen people for years and
Mm-hmm.
years, or that you haven't seen for years just yesterday.
Yeah.
And so it's like when you walked in my door, I'm like, oh my gosh, I physically haven't seen you.
Right.
I think the last time I for sure saw you was, I think I was picking up a trombone. I don't know if you
Oh.
remember that. You guys had a trombone,
Right.
and I had to borrow it for a Christmas ward event.
That's right.
And that was great. That was
Yeah.
awesome. And I offered a free lesson for your son or daughter, and they said, no way.
Yeah, that was our son.
Guess not that interested in
That
it.
son is now in Ghana on a mission.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. Well, I mean,
And he's playing the piano, so the
Oh.
piano helped him more than the trombone.
good. I bet it did. I bet it did. Well, Professor Chad Emmett, you were my Middle East geography of the Middle East professor
Yes.
back in the day. I think it was 2010 is when I took your class. I had just gotten back from my mission in Seattle and was diving headfirst into the Middle East Studies in Arabic degree.
Right.
And one of the requirements was this class. And it was awesome. It was phenomenal. I a lot of people, you show a lot of photos because you've got it. How do you see what it is, right?
Yeah, right.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I know sometimes people go, oh man, another day of photos. But how else do you see what it's like,
Yeah.
right? You got to
I
do
agree.
that.
I
So,
agree.
I enjoyed it. I think I got a B plus. We'll go with the B plus.
Okay.
I know I didn't
That's
get an
good.
A.
Oh, good.
I, for whatever reason, couldn't get A's at BYU as easily as I used to. But a little bit about you before we dive further into the topic. You're from Logan, Utah. You now live in Springville, but you served a mission in Indonesia as a full-time missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from 75 to 77. You got your PhD at the University of Chicago in geography, and you've been teaching at Brigham Young University for 27 years.
Yes.
Yeah. Does that make you feel old?
Yes. I am old.
Well, you don't act like it, so that's good. You're in the geography department, obviously PhD in geography. I hope you're teaching geography.
Yeah.
And then, but some of the classes, political geography of the Middle East, Southeast Asia geography, world geography. And it seems like probably a random class here and there that pops up. Some professor wants to add this to their major or something like that.
I actually taught Indonesian for about 7 years to return missionaries because nobody
Oh, wow.
else on campus could do it. So
Interesting. Do they still have Indonesian?
yeah, I helped find a local Indonesian who teaches it, but I did it
Oh,
for 7 years. So.
wow. And
was
was
fun.
that shortly after your mission, or was it like?
No, that was just until about 4 years ago.
Wow.
So
So you
had
you
to
feel
brush up.
comfortable. I was about to say you feel comfortable speaking it.
No, well, I've kept it up better than some of my missionary colleagues, but
Yeah.
I'm not great at it. But better than my Arabic, I'll say that.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, my dad, who went to Korea, he's just like, no, don't even try to put me in that situation.
Yeah.
To get Korean, and so he remembers the key words.
Yeah.
But that's awesome that you were able to do that.
Well, and just 2 years ago and 3 years ago, I went back with some BYU geology professor, Ron Harris, and we did tsunami mitigation training. And so I worked with local Indonesian geologists going into schools, and I was one of the ones who would stand up and teach them what to do if there was a tsunami. So I can still, get a maneuver in with Indonesian. So
That's awesome.
yeah.
That's pretty cool. Do they speak like in Singapore? Like the missionaries that go there, they typically only speak English.
Right.
Indonesia is not so much the case.
No, they all learn Indonesian. Singapore, a lot more. Yeah, English is, I think, an official language
Of the country.
And, yeah. But Indonesians, a lot of them are learning English, but they don't know it that
Yeah.
well. So
Yeah. I had a roommate from Malaysia, and English was definitely a second language there.
Yeah.
So to me, in my mind, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore are they're in the same
in
region.
Malaysia, they now learn Malaysian and teach in that. Singapore as a country is different. It's mostly Chinese, and so.
Yeah.
But Malaysia it's almost the same language. Malaysian
As
and Indonesian.
Indonesian.
Yeah, they're just
Really?
it's like almost British and American English.
Oh wow, that close.
yeah.
So not like Portuguese. Well, I guess Portuguese and Spanish kind of
Yeah.
kind of close there. But interesting.
When I go to Malaysia, I talk Indonesian. They understand me. They
understand
know
you.
I'm just mainly from my vocabulary. That's the
Gotcha.
main thing that differs.
Gotcha. And same with like Scandinavian countries, like Danish to Swedish and Norwegian. It's they really know they can understand each other, and they always know who's Danish because they always say that they've got a potato in the back of their mouth. I guess that's anyway.
Yeah.
So they speak differently, but that's a common topic when I talk to the Scandinavians, if they're not from Denmark.
Oh, yeah.
The other Sweden and Norway, they love to make fun of the Danes.
Danes,
All right, so. The topic today is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, primarily the individual saints in the country of Indonesia. A lot of people don't know this, but Indonesia is a majority Muslim country where Christianity's and you'll have to correct me, but I mean Christianity is just as low as any other religion, Buddhism and well, I almost said Baha'i, Hinduism.
Yeah.
It's not very popular, or not popular, but not very common.
Right.
I think the Salt Lake Tribune article said like 1 out of 38,000 is Christian.
I don't know that it's about 9 to 10% Christian.
Okay. Okay, so that's definitely not 1 out of 38,000.
Yeah.
So maybe 1 out of 38,000 is a member of the church.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. No, that wouldn't work either.
I don't know.
There's 7,000 members there, so it's very
that
small.
definitely is not the case.
And it's fourth largest country in the world, so there are a lot of people there.
Yeah. Well, why don't you give us a little bit of more information about the country, and then we'll dive so that like today, and then the country today, and then we can dive into the history. Because in the title I have 50 years, but you were saying before we started that it's actually been well over 50 years that the church has been there.
Yeah. So in my geography classes, I always talk about why Indonesia. And I actually list a lot of words from the language. And I have students at BYU who know a lot of languages, and they say, oh, that's a Portuguese word. Oh, that's an Arabic word. Oh, that's a Dutch word. That's a Chinese or Sanskrit word. But they're all part of the Indonesian language. And I say, why is that? And then they think, for a while, they come up with, spices. Trade. And so all of these people came mainly for spices, and in the process they brought their religion, they brought their language. So over time Indonesia was first, it was animist, but then 2,000 years ago Hindu and Buddhist traders from India came, Buddhists from China came, then later Arab Muslims came, and some from India brought Islam. And then later, first the Portuguese, then the Dutch came and brought Christianity. And so you have this progression of peoples, and it was usually merchants coming to trade, but also coming with the religion. And as they would stay, they would intermarry. They would talk about the religion. People would convert. And so part of the conclusion, the extension of that story is that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was also carried into Indonesia mainly by initially traders, businessmen, foreign service officers, but it was people peddling politics or even the Osmond family peddling music. And so it's just this.
The Osmonds made a big impact in Seattle.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many inactives or not active members were like, oh, I just joined because the Osmonds were members.
Yeah. So. that happened in far of Indonesia too.
Wow,
so
that's crazy.
Yeah, so it's interesting that this country, it's Muslim, but before Islam came, there were Hindus and Buddhists there. Many of them converted, but the island of Bali is still almost all Hindu. And when the Portuguese and the Dutch came, the Spice Islands of eastern Indonesia were not yet fully Islamic, and so Christianity took root there. And so when Indonesia declared its independence and they were trying to establish the country, there was a big debate. Should it become an Islamic state with Islamic law? And there was a big push for that. And Sukarno, the leader of the nationalist movement, said, we can't. If we do that, we lose the Hindus, we lose the Christians, we lose the Buddhists. We can't. We have to be a country where all religions are accepted. And so the founding documents of Indonesia say that at the time, there were 5 official languages: Islam, Catholicism, Protestantism, Hinduism, and Buddhism.
Wow.
And then they've added Confucianism. But that's one of the amazing kind of points in history where had Sukarno, who was a Muslim, had not stood up and said, no, we will not be an Islamic state, then I don't think missionaries from any religion would have been allowed.
Yeah.
It would have been, and you know, the LDS Church still is very limited in what countries it can go into, and you know, in Jordan or Lebanon, they can go in and teach Christians, but they can't teach Muslims. In Malaysia, they can't teach Muslims. And so Indonesia stands out as one of the few Islamic majority countries where it's not against the law, it's not punishable by death to teach about religion, to convert, to become a Christian. So it really is
interesting,
more open than a lot of other countries.
Yeah, and actually, I spent a lot of time. I mean, most people don't realize, but the world's majority of Muslims live in these countries.
Yeah.
Malaysia, Malaysia, and Indonesia.
Yeah. And then add Pakistan and Bangladesh. I mean, they're non-Middle Eastern countries.
Non-Middle East, right. Yeah. Everyone thinks Islam is only not only, but majorities in the Middle East. And yes, there's over, what is it now, 150 million in the Middle East. The majority of them are Muslim, but you got what? 1 billion? I mean, that's exaggeration there, but I always felt like it was like it was. I guess I compared to. I mean, how many? What's the population of Indonesia?
It's probably I don't even know for sure. Probably 250 million.
Yeah.
But then you add, 200 million in Bangladesh or in Pakistan, and then India has the same amount of Muslims as Pakistan. China has a lot of Muslims. Malaysia. I mean, there are a lot of. I think other than non-Southwest Asia, you've got Muslims.
Yeah,
a lot of Muslims.
Yeah. There's and with it being 90% at least, or at the most 90%.
Yeah.
10% or give or take Christian. What would you say is the percentage of other religions like Hinduism?
Well,
or Buddhism?
I think Indonesia officially says it's 87% Muslim.
Okay.
10% Christian, 9 to 10% Christian, then Hindus. Maybe 1 or 2, and then there are not a lot of Buddhists. Mainly the Chinese immigrants would claim to be Buddhists. So,
okay, now that makes sense. Yeah, we my roommate actually at BYU, he was from Malaysia, and he was really a Chinese immigrant that went to Malaysia, I think, to evade the government. Okay, so we've made it clear that the Middle East is not just the hub of the Islamic religion. Wow, I am butchering so many things right now. Of the Muslim religion, and we know that you can't just categorize. I mean, we didn't state this, but you can't categorize one type of Muslim like ISIS or ISIL. You can't say, oh, that's all of Islam.
Right.
Would you? Oh, go ahead.
Well, and one thing that's interesting about Indonesia is because there was this progression of religions. And they kind of built on top of each other. And so particularly in Java, kind of the core of the country, Islam there is much more syncretic, mixed than in the Middle East. And so Middle Eastern Muslims sometimes look at Indonesian Islam as not being pure.
Pure, yeah.
And that's probably true, but then you get to northern Sumatra to the province of Aceh, and they're very devout and very strict. They've implemented Sharia law, the only province in Indonesia that allows that. But Indonesian Muslims are generally more tolerant, more willing to kind of bend or
discuss.
Yeah, and still, allow animist practices that are still there in their culture, or have a child convert to Mary and not,
any threats.
Any threats, and that's part of it. A lot of families there have Muslim members or Christian members. It's
wow.
So, and Indonesia now sees its moderate brand of Islam, which is under threat by more radical interpretations of Islam. That's a challenge to Indonesia, is how do they maintain this moderate brand of Islam, but they also want to market their moderate brand of Islam to Middle Eastern countries that are more strict, and say, there can be a more tolerant version of Islam
Yeah.
that still is Islam.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the Indonesians know that about themselves, and they're proud of it, that, our country has religious freedom and there is tolerance.
Yeah, it's a pretty phenomenal thing to think about, of religious freedom. Again, as a blanket statement for most people that don't understand Islam or the individual countries or the portions of the countries. You look at Jordan. Jordan is actually pretty relatively diverse when it comes to religion, especially different Christian churches. Right. One of my favorite things is I walked a lot in Jordan because I couldn't even afford the taxis. But I would see these buildings and you go, oh, that's a church. It looks like an apartment building compared to the mosque that's, built like a mosque, a traditional mosque. But all the time I'd see, Greek Orthodox Church or
Roman Catholic. Maronite.
Maronite. Yeah. More of the older, definitely the older Christian churches, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, and that's an important point, that, in the Middle East, Christians are tolerated too.
Yes.
But I think, so Islam, it is a tolerant religion for religious minorities, but in some countries it's if those minorities know their place, which is, maybe like in Egypt, the Coptic Christians are restricted in building new churches, or they're restricted in having missionaries, or Saudi Arabia, one of the most extreme, having religious books, importing those. So it really does vary, but I think Indonesia is just a step ahead, or a little bit more tolerant than you'd find in other countries.
Yeah, from what I remember now, I did do a few papers on that one county or city portion of the country that does have Sharia law. That it's more of a phenomenon than the norm. Yeah, it's definitely not the culture.
It's the exception, I think.
Exactly, definitely the exception. Now, okay, so we can talk. Let's talk about the church. The church has. You talked about merchants. The church obviously has all types of, and since the beginning has had people with different trades. Even Joseph Smith Sr., the prophet's father, invested in trading, in ship trading, and lost a lot of money. And so that's actually part of the reason why they moved to Palmyra. Is because I got to earn my money back, and he heard that there's money in that portion of in that area of the state. So anyway, it's not that the church is ignorant of trades or opposed to things like that. So if you've got merchants coming over, you said, what's the earliest that we have of records?
So, and I'm not certain on this, but I found as early as, and I've got a timeline here so I can remember, 1915, a Dutch naval officer was assigned to the Dutch East Indies port of Surabaya.
Wow.
And so from 1915 till after World War II, there were 6 or 7 or 8 Dutch families who'd come for 3 years or 6 years, Dutch LDS families.
Interesting.
And so there were evidence of, they would have sacrament meetings, there were baptisms of children. I like to say that the first kind of challenge to become a Mormon was an 8-year-old girl, Grace Vlam, whose father was the first Latter-day Saint that I know of in Indonesia. And they offered to teach a Sunday school class to the Dutch children of the sailors, with the stipulation from the non-Latter-day Saint family that it just stick to the Bible. And so Peter Vlam and his wife would teach these kids about, the baptism of Jesus or the Sermon on the Mount. But then their daughter Grace learned separately at home from her parents that to be baptized, you need to have the proper authority. And she told these kids that she was studying with my dad has that proper authority. He needs to baptize you. So do you want to be baptized? And so then these kids go home and says, Grace Vlam says her dad needs to baptize us. And the parents go back to the Vlams and say, this wasn't part of the agreement. They say, oh, well, that wasn't us. And
Yeah.
so
That's awesome.
But then 2 years, 1921, a Frank Beecraft from Ogden, who had studied engineering at the University of Utah and had worked in the sugar factories of Utah, sugar beets.
Yeah.
He went over to Surabaya to work in a sugar factory that the Dutch had. And he was there for 3 years. And while he was there, one of his seminary teachers, I think, David O. McKay, a young apostle, was on a round-the-world tour, and he stopped in Indonesia to meet Frank Beecraft in 1921, and then stopped in Batavia, now Jakarta. So, but there were no Latter-day Saints at that point. There were no Dutch sailors. Okay. There was just the one guy from Ogden, and then David O. McKay and his traveling companion. So it was kind of on and off. But then the one story I really like to tell, and this is, so during World War II, a young, recently widowed woman from Tooele, Maxine Tate, volunteered with the Red Cross to go, and she was assigned to the Philippines to work with soldiers that had been wounded. And while she was there, she met a merchant marine who had been drafted and was living there. Frank Grimm, not Pete Grimm. And they ended up getting married and making Manila their home after the war.
Wow.
And he, before the war, had been a merchant marine. He was a sailor and trading, and so they bought a kind of a schooner, and they would sail around Southeast Asia from Hong Kong to Singapore to Jakarta from their base in Manila, trading, and he was just kind of an entrepreneurial businessman.
Yeah.
They had 2 kids, and they would get on this boat and they would sail. And Maxine was just this devout Mormon girl, young lady, and with her kids, and her husband was not yet a member, but she said every harbor they went into, she would have copies of the Book of Mormon and pamphlets, and she'd sail into the harbor, and they would have harbor masters who would get on their boat to bring them in through the mines left over from World War II. She said, I always had a trapped audience. These harbor masters would come on, and she'd say, what do you know about, let me tell you about my church. And so she did this from the early 1950s up until the 1970s. And on a side note, the Grimm home was the first home in Manila when the first missionaries came in 1960 to Manila. The Grimms were
they were like the base.
They were the base. They had the organ. They had a swimming pool for the baptisms. All the general authorities would stay with them when they were in the Philippines. And so Maxine got to know all the general authorities that would come.
Wow.
And then
she's still alive.
She passed away about a year ago at the age of 101 or 102.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
So I interviewed her about 10 years ago a couple of times at her home in Tooele. And so she was telling me these stories. I knew about her because my in-laws had lived in Manila at one point and knew her and recommended that I talk to her. But in her travels, they met a Christian man from northern Sulawesi in Indonesia. His name's Jan Walandau. And he was intrigued as Maxine would talk about her religion. And he became very interested, and he came to the United States on business and met Ezra Taft Benson, one of the church leaders. And he kept saying, I want to join your church, and I want to be the first one to be baptized. And then Maxine, whenever she was back home in Tooele or home in Manila, and a leader of the church would come over, she would say, we need missionaries in Indonesia. And Jan Walandau would say, when are your missionaries going to come? I want to be baptized. And so there was, for 20 years, Maxine was, they would hold sacrament meeting on their little ship with whoever was around. Yeah.
Or stuck.
Yeah, stuck, exactly. So I like to think of her really, other than young Grace Vlam, the 6-year-old, challenging her friends to get baptized. I like to think of Maxine Grimm as this unofficial missionary, just on her own, just befriending people. And so she was there. Never lived in Indonesia, but they were always coming and going. And they
Yeah.
had this very influential friend who knew President Sukarno and then President Suharto. And so, but then, over time in the 1959, George Hansen, a geology professor from BYU, was assigned or recruited by the USAID to go in and help establish the first geology department in Indonesia's main university. So he and his wife went over there and lived for a few years. And there were other USAID people who came and went. The Hansens are important because they were approached by a young man who said, if you'll let me live with you so I can go to school in this city, I will do whatever you need me to do. I'll do your yard work. I'll do your driving. I'll do your translating. And he lived with them and just watched them. They were very non-pushy about religion, but he saw them living it. And they then left in the late 50s, but for the next 10 years, they kept in contact with him, sent him church publications, and then they knew of another LDS family going to teach in Indonesia, I believe, and they hooked him up with this Indonesian young man, Sutrisno, and then those new LDS families in the late 60s taught him, and he was baptized in the summer of 1969, the first Indonesian to be baptized.
Yeah, okay.
So, and then about that, so there were always kind of on and off people coming and going, but then, in 1965, Indonesia has this communist coup, and it was horrible. A lot of people were massacred, and just very tumultuous time, and a lot of Muslims converted to various Christian sects because they were disillusioned with how Islam had reacted to the massacres. And
Interesting.
so there was a lot of this upheaval and turmoil, and there was a desire to kind of change Indonesia for the better after this very troublesome time. And right as they were kind of on the rebound from that coup and massacre, there were a handful of mainly American Foreign Service officers and a Canadian Foreign Service officer, the Butlers. The Van der Hoevens were another family. They all got assigned to Indonesia at about the same time. And they connected with each other.
From their military? From the U.S. and the Canadian militaries? Or?
Oh, yeah. No, they were assigned there, by the from the State Department or the Canadian Foreign Ministry or USAID.
Yeah.
Some were just there on business. And all at once they had 5 or 6 families that were LDS meeting in homes, and then they meet Sutrisno and they baptize him. And at the same time, Maxine Grimm and Yanwa Landau are encouraging general authorities to send missionaries.
Do something.
And then Maxine Grimm and her husband were in Hong Kong, and they got to know the mission president there, Brent Hardy of the Southern Far East Mission, that included all of Southeast Asia. And they said, you need to go to Indonesia. When are we gonna... So Brent Hardy in 1969, he goes 2 different times, and Yanwa Landau shows him around, and the Grimms show him around, and he realizes that, wow. And he sends back reports to Salt Lake. And then Howard W. Hunter, one of the apostles, stops in on his way back from Australia, also checks things out, and they go back to Salt Lake and say, it's looking good, it's looking good.
Wow.
So it was kind of, it's amazing to see how there were just kind of all these pieces coming together. And then an Indonesian couple had gone to the Netherlands for an eye operation for the wife. And while they were there, they met some Mormon missionaries and were converted and baptized, then came back to Jakarta, and they found this Mormon group. And so by the time in October, and this is what they're celebrating, the 50th anniversary, on October 26, 1969, Elder Ezra Taft Benson dedicated Indonesia for the preaching of the gospel. He was accompanied by Elder Bruce R. McConkie. And at that dedication, it was mainly all of these expatriate families, plus Pete Grimm was there. His wife wasn't, Maxine wasn't. Sutrisno was there. Yanwa Landau couldn't make it, but his cousin, who later joined the church, was there. But they they dedicated the church, and then in January of 1970, the first 6 missionaries came in from the newly organized Southeast Asia mission,
Wow.
headquartered in Singapore.
So, wow. So lots of, I mean, you're right. Lots of little things. Sometimes there were families, sometimes there weren't, over basically 50 years.
Yeah.
If it's 1912,
Yeah.
1917, around there, to 1970 is the dedication. So you have your first convert, first Indonesian convert in Indonesia. And then you have people kind of scoping it out, making sure it's okay.
Yeah.
What would you say is good, quote unquote good? Like, oh, this is good for us to send missionaries to.
Uh-huh.
What would you say is the church's standards on that?
Meaning, well, I mean, it was a large country. It was an independent country. I think the Islamic component of it was always a concern. And even now, I think Indonesia sometimes gets
lumped into this.
Yeah. And so there's more caution.
Yeah.
And I even experienced that at BYU to, get travel permission there. There's just, oh no, an Islamic country,
Well, I think you probably don't remember because you have them all the time with your students, but I know we've had at least 2. I think one in your class. We were stuck. You were stuck. I was talking to you for like an hour and a half. You're like, I think I gotta go. And this poor student of yours was talking to you. But I think we had another conversation, and that other conversation talked about the safety blankets.
Yeah.
And I say that in that way because it's sometimes it's almost too safe.
Yeah.
Like what you're saying, like, oh, you want to go to an Islamic country? Like, oh, it's too scary. Or, and luckily at BYU, at least at the time when I was there, we had travel advisors. And when I was on my way to Jordan, I was like, look, South Provo is more dangerous than Jordan.
Yeah.
The likelihood of you getting beat up by, sorry to say it, but a Polynesian gang is extremely high versus getting beat up by some Arabs.
Yeah. Right.
Anyway, it was very, very interesting to me. And we actually wanted to go to Morocco on the way there. And it was because because BYU wasn't really doing much in Morocco and it was an Islamic country. They said, no way.
Yeah.
And so it's like, darn it.
And finally now they'll let students go to Morocco, but that's one of the few countries that they allow them to go to.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So the safety blanket is there that kind of stops. I think that kind of stuff is a hindrance to the building of bridges.
Oh yeah.
Would you say?
Oh, yeah. And it's frustrating. I mean, I was banned for about 6 or 7 years from going to Indonesia, and I would even go, and finally by then they were sending young American sister missionaries to Indonesia.
Oh, wow. And you still couldn't go.
And I still couldn't go. So sometimes BYU was overly cautious.
Yeah.
But, don't get me going on that.
Yeah. And I get it, right? You want to keep people safe. But I mean, heaven forbid we send people to the Jerusalem Center while rockets are being shot over it. But you can't go to Indonesia.
Yeah.
All right. So sorry, little tangent there, and maybe we can talk more about it later. But so 1970 gets dedicated. You served from 75 to 77. So there's been 5 years of missionaries. Was it a lot of missionaries or?
No, it was. So I go in. I'm in the first group of 8 missionaries called to the newly organized Indonesia Jakarta mission.
Oh, wow. Okay.
All the other ones were part of the Singapore mission, which included Thailand, Singapore, and Indonesia. Not Malaysia yet.
Okay.
And it was always throughout my mission, it was ranged from 30 to 50, but 50 was the maximum. And it started out first 6 and then another 4. And so it was maybe, 20, 25, 30, not a lot.
Yeah.
And they go in and they have nothing translated. It's these first 6 missionaries. It was pretty
brutal.
And they had to come up with, it's fun to look at, they had to come up with religious terminology and they, hymns and get scriptures translated. But one thing that's interesting is that most religious terminology in Indonesia comes from Islam. So Latter-day Saints in Indonesia in the sacrament prayer and in the song I Am a Child of God use Allah. And the word for Holy Ghost, Roh Kudus, comes from Ruah al-Kodesh. And the word for prophet, Nabi you say Nabi Joseph Smith, the prophet Joseph Smith, an apostle is Rasul,
Yeah.
and so they're learning all of these Arabic words, and sometimes they're picking, they they don't get it right, and
Yeah. Well, I mean, how old are they?
yeah, they're
19?
19, and it was really a challenge,
Yeah.
to come up with, and for the name of the church. So Igreja comes from Portuguese, Igreja. Igreja Jesus Christus dari orang-orang. Orang-orang means people. That comes from the word orang hutan or orangutan, person of the jungle.
Oh, wow.
So, but then the orang-orang suci, but they wanted to use for saint. So people saints. They want to use the word kudus from the Arabic for holy.
Oh, interesting.
But there's a town in Indonesia called Kudus. And so they said, if we say orang-orang Kudus, they think, we're Church of Jesus Christ from the people from the town.
Yeah.
So they use the Sanskrit, I think it's Sanskrit or Malay word suci, which means holy. But then the latter days is zaman akhir, which are both Arabic words for the last times.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting mix, but they had to figure out,
Wow.
how do we...
That was almost a headache, not a headache, but just a mind game right there, trying to follow what you were just saying. Holy smokes!
So they get these words that come from all these different languages, but they've got to make sure it fits and it's appropriate. And
so they came with no. I mean, obviously the Book of Mormon is going to be in English. Is the Bible in?
They have
Indonesian?
a Bible in Indonesian, and for the first 5 years until the Book of Mormon was translated in 1976. Before that, they had selections from maybe 74 on that I used as a missionary. But there were always Indonesians still the older ones who spoke Dutch, or some spoke Chinese or English. So we always had copies of the Book of Mormon in those languages.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the early converts used Chinese, Dutch, or English copies.
Even for me, I served in Seattle. Huge. I mean, if you want a melting pot, Seattle is a melting pot. And at least we somehow found all the diverse people, which was awesome. And we would teach people, go, hey, here's you're from DR Congo. Here's a Swahili Book of Mormon. He goes, oh no, I actually would prefer the French. It's like, oh, okay. So we give him both. He goes, yeah, actually, this is what it means in French. This is what it means in Swahili. He goes, I think I understand. I'm like, okay, I'll just go with it.
Yeah. No, that's whatever works.
Yeah, whatever works. So, and my guess is it's probably been revised for those corrections.
Yeah. They've had several. One big revision just recently of all four standard works, and they go through it. And these are now Indonesians who are, some of them second generation, but the return missionaries. They get it, and so they go through and they say, oh well, there's a better word for that. And it's just an ongoing process.
And it seemed, even in Arabic, even when I would go to the church, there was always like, especially the Arabs, be like, that's not really the right word.
Yeah.
And poor Dill Parkinson, he was there going, hey, I translated that.
You're right. Yeah.
So the, maybe 20, 30, give or take during those early years, would you say that they had success? Meaning, did they convert a handful, or what did the numbers look like?
And when I was there, we averaged about 3 baptisms a year, not a lot
Per missionary, or
per missionary, and so that maybe 150 baptisms a year, and not a lot. But the interesting thing is, many of those early families are still there with their 3rd generation now, and some of those early converts are now the CES director for all of Asia, or
that's cool.
A patriarch. And one of the Indonesians said that they found that these Indonesian Latter-day Saints are very grounded, and then the church uses them to go into countries like Malaysia or Cambodia or even Mongolia, where it's growing faster, but it's newer, and they don't have the maturity of multi-generational families who've been members for 50 years. And there's a lot of inactivity. People fall away, or people switch religions when they get married, but there are just some really kind of solid families that joined those early years. But it wasn't It was hard. I mean,
Yeah.
Java, were the first 8 cities, the first 8 branches were mostly Muslims. There are a lot of Chinese, but and there's a good percentage. It's kind of a sensitive topic, but I've interviewed many families who they joined the church out of Islam, or their parents had been Muslims who went to Catholic school, became Catholic, and then later joined the LDS church.
I feel like for those in the Middle East or that are connected to Islam, the Catholic Church always is a stepping stone.
Yeah. Well,
I shouldn't say always, but it helps.
Well, and here's a tangent, but I'm go to Indonesia at the time of Bruce R. McConkey's Mormon doctrine, and the Great and Abominable Church is associated with the Catholics, and I kind of went with that idea. But partway through my mission, I had a change of heart where most of the people we taught who were responsive had gone to a Catholic school. That's where they'd learned about Jesus, and I started to see them as an Elias going before the Messiah. That,
Yes.
Had the Portuguese were anxiously engaged in spreading Christianity. The Dutch didn't want to do. They didn't do that because it would get in the way of their
business. Yeah.
But they prepared the way too.
Yeah.
Many of the converts are those that come from the Christianized tribes, ethnic groups in Indonesia.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, it's to a lot of people, especially if you're coming from Islam, where the Prophet Muhammad is the last prophet.
Right?
And my discussions with I didn't have a whole lot of religious discussions, unfortunately, and for the benefit of many people, the church primarily in Jordan, we had to be careful, right? What we say and how much we go into, but it was just like, what? You have a prophet today? Like, how could you have a prophet today when Muhammad is the last prophet? And so that's hard. So the idea that someone coming to Catholicism or even Methodist, I think there's a handful of those in at least one in Egypt that came from Methodist church, Islam to Methodist, to the Methodists, and then joined the church. And so it was, it's a stepping stone to to be prepared, I guess, to be better understanding or more willing to understand that there's another prophet.
For me, though, I think the bigger challenge was Jesus as the Son of God and our Savior.
Yes.
That was because, I mean, you talk about Joseph Smith or prophets in the Book of Mormon, and at least the Muslims of Indonesia, it wasn't like, well, that can't, and maybe more ancient prophets, but they were willing to consider that God would reveal truths to people beyond the Holy Land.
Yeah.
But the bigger, for me, it was, unless they'd gone to Catholic school, the idea of a Savior and Jesus being the Son of God, and that was a hard thing.
Extremely foreign. Yeah. Would you say that they're taught against that? That like the Muslim schools or ideology in the mosques, were they saying like anti-Christian?
Not really. Within Islam, there is that teaching that God doesn't beget, that there's not a son or children. But there wasn't, and granted, when I was there in the 70s, fewer women had a hijab or a jilbab on. And I think it was less rigid.
Yeah.
I think in the last 50 years, Indonesia has become there are more devout Muslims around, and Islam is more of an identity, which I think has created more problems.
I mean, I haven't been to Istanbul a whole lot, but my understanding, and even from one trip to the next, before the coup and after the coup, there was definitely more rigid following of Islam in one of the most, quote unquote, progressive Islamic cities in the world. And so I do think it's not naturally, but more worldwide, it's happening.
Yeah.
So, all right. So 120 baptisms in a year. I mean, geez. Korea, Lauren, how many baptisms would your mission in Korea see in a year? 80. Yeah. I mean, it's pretty. I mean, and you go to Germany or certain parts of Europe, Spain, you'll be lucky.
I was always comparing it to my friends in Latin
Yeah.
America, and
Brazil
back then
or
it was like,
Argentina.
so,
Or the Philippines even.
yeah,
Philippines just seem to baptize quite a bit.
yeah,
But nonetheless, I mean that's still it's awesome to see that those early converts were a foundation.
yeah,
That's I think that's crucial for any new country that's new to the gospel, to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is if without that foundation you can't have you can't grow. I
yeah,
mean, you've got to have that.
yeah.
So when you come on the scene, what was it like?
It was, I mean, there were 8 established branches. There were members, but they were small. We were meeting in homes, and it, truthfully, it was hard. There were some weeks I would maybe do 2 lessons a week of teaching. It was, and by then, the first few years, the missionaries could actually knock on doors. But by the time I got there, mainly in opposition to Jehovah's Witnesses, who had also been very aggressive proselytizing, they had just said no door-to-door knocking.
Wow.
So we spent our whole time just street contacting and teaching English and, some member recommendations, but referrals. Yeah. It was hard though, to teach, and people, especially the Javanese, don't want to offend you. And so they wouldn't tell you no.
Yeah.
So you'd go for teach and teach and teach, but they'd never come to church.
Yeah.
They'd never pray. So it was, it was challenging, but I loved it. It was a lot of fun. But one of the challenges so from the get-go, getting the church organized was a challenge, and they finally got recognition. But then the question of visas was always an issue.
Really?
And the challenge is that most Christian missionary programs are you go with your family and you live in Borneo or Western New Guinea for 10 years, and you set up a health clinic or a school, and so congregations would send in 5 families, or Christian section, the Baptists, or the Baptists would have the Adventists had great hospitals. We'd go there to get our shots, and so then in come the Mormon missionaries, and it's 50, and every few months it's more coming and more going home, and they're having to issue more visas, and they're going, we don't, and there are still those Muslims in Indonesia who are saying we should be an Islamic state.
Oh yeah.
And so then they would say, okay, we'll give you a 6-month visa, and then they'll extend it, or we'll give you, and then they'll extend it, and then every 8 months or so they'd have to go to Singapore to get the visa renewed.
Yeah.
And then finally in 1978, the Islamists finally convinced President Suharto to pass a law saying that, no door-to-door proselyting, no giving financial or gift incentives to join, no handing out publications, and then another edict that said no foreign missionaries.
Oh, wow.
So in 1978, this was passed, but it took until 1981. But in 1981, the last foreign LDS missionaries left Indonesia after only 11 years.
Wow.
And by then, the first native missionaries were in 1975. By then, there were maybe 20 or 30 local missionaries.
Yeah.
And truthfully, we all just thought, how's it going to survive?
Yeah.
How are these 8 branches?
Yeah.
And for 20 years, there are no foreign missionaries. And these Indonesians have a term, berdikari, which means stand on your own 2 feet. And I've got a photo of a family, 7 kids, when I was a missionary, and I went back 20 years later, and their mother showed me a photo of all 7 of those kids having served on missions.
Wow.
And that happened in family after family, that these snot-nosed kids that, I knew in church.
There's hope.
Yeah,
there's hope for those kids.
They rose to the occasion, and they then kind of figured it out. And maybe that's where the stability and the steadiness comes from, is that oddity, and that was always a problem. And just, for example, this is a fun story. One of the first Dutch missionaries to come came in and didn't go to the MTC to learn the language, just struggled with the language. The mission president, Hendrik Hout, my mission president, was grew up in Indonesia, the child of a Dutch colonist, but he was called back then to be a mission president. Yeah. And he has this Dutch missionary who he really likes, and this missionary was one of the first to come up with the you've got to get a visa renewed. And he went to Singapore and to get it renewed, and they stamped, a 3-month extension, and then they stamped in his passport, cannot be renewed. And so he comes back to Indonesia just heartbroken that, a year into his mission, he's going to have to go home. And so he keeps calling President Hout. And this was then this started to happen with all these other missionaries after him. And he was kind of the trial case. And and so he was, he called President Hout and say, what are we going to do? Call the missionary department. The missionary department comes back and they said, we can't do anything. We'll assign you to someplace else. I think like we can send you back to the Netherlands. And he says, call him again, President Hout. And they come back and says, well, we can assign you to the Philippines, which is what happened to a lot of later missionaries. They were assigned to the Philippines. But he says, I don't want to go to the Philippines. I just learned the language. And so President Hout one day just called up Elder van der Vlies and said, there's been a fire. You need to come to Jakarta, and we need to go get you a new passport. And President Hout was just this mild-mannered, sweet old guy. And he went and got a passport. And later at the end of his mission, he went to President Hout. And he says, President Hout, can you give me back that passport? I want a souvenir. And President Hout says, I don't have your passport. But there was nothing else burned in the mission element. And President Hout, I can't verify this because he passed away, and I asked his wife, but Elder van der Vlies is sure that President Hout just in desperation knew of no other way to keep this missionary in the country. And the thought came to him, a new passport wouldn't have that stamp in it. So he stayed his full 2 years.
That's awesome. I mean, it's a funny story. And I think to me, you hear those stories and you realize, we hear these miracle stories. Oh, the government had change of heart, or someone accidentally stamped it incorrectly. And, or because while you're on your mission in Australia, you got an Australian driver's license. Right. And then during World War II, because you had an Australian license versus an American license, you were saved or something, Yeah. But here you are. There was a fire.
That was all he said. So it's then one other story, talking about being a Christian church in an Islamic country. Then during these 20 years, finally in the 1990s, when Indonesia was now part of the Singapore mission again, and it kind of went back and forth, they started to send in Singapore missionaries wearing batik shirts, non-white shirts, to train the local missionaries. And it really was a nice thing to just have missionaries from Singapore or the United States come in, and their goal was to fellowship and to teach, but not to proselytize, and mainly do training. And one day they were going to visit a family that had been recommended by a neighbor. He wanted to be taught. They go in, and this man's son, come to find out, got some friends, and they march into this house, and there's an American missionary and a Singapore missionary, and they slashed the tires, and they came in and started to pound on these two missionaries.
Oh, wow.
And the Elder Monson stood up, and he was pretty big, and so then they turned on the Indonesian missionary, his companion, and hauled him off to jail. And the American missionary, they said, you can't be teaching Muslims. And he could. They were misinterpreting the law, but they were saying you couldn't do that, and we're going to hold you. So the Indonesian companion goes and calls the mission president in Singapore, who's going, oh no, I've got an American elder in jail. What am I going to do? And this mission president, and I'm thinking it's Carl Warren, but he had worked with the World Health Organization in Indonesia the previous decade, and he was just beside himself. What am I going to do? This could be a big deal if they want to make it a big deal. A Christian missionary.
All over the place.
And just, paranoid. And so he calls the area presidency in Hong Kong and says, what do I do? And he said, what do you think? And so he's praying, and the thought comes to him, you've lived and worked here. Use your experience. And he's thinking, what's my experience? And he thinks, my experience is if you want to get something done in this government, you offer them some money. You basically bribe them. And that's a sensitive topic. I'm not quite sure. And he gets two of his good Latter-day Saint ones working in the church office building and sends them off with some money. And this is the problem of writing history is, according to the mission president's memory, that money was used to whisk that guy, get him out of the police station. They weren't in the jail. They're just kind of on a bench in the police station waiting to see what happens. But get him to Jakarta, fly him to Singapore. According to one of the Indonesians who was sent, he doesn't remember ever having to offer the money.
Oh, interesting.
So I'm not quite, I kind of have to write both versions.
Yeah.
But the mission president felt like that's what I've got to do. And that, brought an end to that interlude of having Singapore missionaries come in and train. But then the other exciting story about all of this is then in sometime in the 1980s, a Mormon merchant, Hal Jensen, a businessman, entrepreneur who'd done a lot of things in Indonesia, he had a question about a new project and if it would be appropriate for Muslims to. It was kind of a lotto thing, scratch and win lotto thing. Wondering, could Muslims do that?
Yeah.
And so somebody says, well, you ought to go talk to Gustur, a nickname for Abdurrahman Wahid, the head of the largest Islamic organization in Indonesia and the world, Nahdlatul Ulama. And he goes to him and says, and even before he asks him about his question, he goes in and this Wahid offers him some tea. And Hal Jensen had been to Indonesia over the decades, and his automatic response is, no, thank you, I don't drink tea, I'm a Mormon. And Wahid knew, he'd been in the World Council of Churches or some ecumenical organization, and he knew about the church. And he said, oh, you're a Latter-day Saint, I've learned all about them. And they became friends. And
cool.
Over the years, he would always visit him. And then this Wahid decided he wanted to run thinking about running for president. And so in the late 90s. And so Hal Jensen knew that this man had major eye problems. And so he said, let me help you. Let me fly you to Salt Lake City to the Moran Eye Institute and see if we can get your eyes fixed. And so the owner of New Skin offered the jet.
Wow.
And they fly him here, and he has the eye operation. And then while he's there, Hal Jensen calls his friend Boyd Packer and says, I've got this Muslim cleric from Indonesia in town. Any interest in meeting him? Elder Packer says, I'd love to meet him. Bring him by the office. And then he meets President Hinckley and gets a priesthood blessing from Neil A. Maxwell. Who knew?
And he just had this grand tour
right,
of the general authorities.
Right. And so then he comes back for a follow-up eye exam, and he goes to Hal Jensen's, Dear Val, I invite you to come to my country.
This is starting to sound familiar, actually.
Well, I've told this story before. It's a great story. And so President Hinckley says, I'd love to. And so it was arranged that next January of 2000 that he would go on a kind of an Asian tour. But that December, there was Christian-Muslim rioting on the island of Lombok. And, church security is going, oh, no, you can't go. And this is a different island than Jakarta on Java. So President Hinckley really wants to go. And he's meeting with his counselors, deciding. Church security says, don't go. Yeah. He meets with his counselors. I don't know what they say. But then he calls up the mission president, who is Subandrio, one name, who joined the church when I was a missionary, and he was this 40-year-old Energizer Bunny serving as mission president. And awesome. President Hinckley calls up Subandrio, 2 a.m. in Indonesia, and Subandrio tells this story that, President Hinckley calls, and Subandrio, the Javanese, according to his culture, should have been very deferential to a senior, somebody older, somebody higher up in the hierarchy. But President Hinckley said, Subandrio, what do you think? Is it safe for me to come or not? And Subandrio, the Javanese, would have said, whatever you think, President Hinckley. But right. Subandrio, the returned missionary, the church employee, now the mission president, says, President Hinckley, we've had Christian-Muslim rioting. We've had an economic crisis a few years ago. We need a prophet to come. I mean, he counseled the prophet. He was asked, but I love that President Hinckley goes down into the trenches and asks. And he's got church security on one side and the mission president on the other side, and he pauses, and then he says, I'll see you in Jakarta.
Nice.
So he goes, and while he's there, he asks the mission president, Subandrio, I'm meeting with President Wahid tomorrow for breakfast. Do you need anything? And Subandrio says, we need foreign missionaries. They're down to about 20 missionaries. So President Hinckley goes into Wahid and said, they're having breakfast and says, hey, is there any chance we can get visas again for our missionaries to come in? Wahid said, sure, we can make that work. So, and then the thing is
Yeah.
nobody dared ask in those 20 years.
No.
Once the ban was made, nobody said, hey, can we revisit this? So it took about a year, but in May of 2001, 8 missionaries serving in Utah from Canada, Australia, and Germany were called in on a Friday by the mission president. You're hereby transferred from the Salt Lake City South Mission to the Indonesia Jakarta Mission. You're to report to the MTC for 2 months to learn Indonesian. And I ended up volunteering to help teach because there were no return missionaries on campus. It had been 20 years. And so a sister from Indonesia, Anna Butler, helped. And then a couple of Indonesians just happened to be in graduate school at BYU and law school and the MBA school. And we taught these missionaries. And in they go.
Wow.
September 11th, they got pulled out for a few months and then sent back in. But it was slow going. At first, it was just 18 visas for foreign missionaries. But then December 26, 2004, they have the tsunami in Aceh. 180,000 people die. And within 3 days, the church has a plane on the ground unloading food and medical supplies and body bags. And then
so my experience with that, I was in the MTC right after that happened, and we actually put together a lot of food supplies in the missionary training center and first aid kits and whatnot, and at the time, Brother Snow, I forget his first name, but he was in charge of LDS Charities, I think, one of those in that category, and he made it very clear. He goes, the number one thing they needed, body bags. Body bags. And we just said yes.
And we set prayer rugs. We said, and then the church, this was the first time the church did more than just humanitarian relief for the moment. They then went in and restored fishing boats. They built hospitals. They built almost 1,000 homes. It was like a 4-year project. And this is in Aceh, the most Islamic province in Indonesia. And the church went in with no strings attached. And just did it because they're children of God. And in the process, we got to know a lot of Indonesian leaders. And they, for the first 30 years of the church, we were always that suspect cult that was polygamous, that was, and even the Christian Indonesians would call us tersesat, which means a kind of an apostate church, or I can't think of the English word, but we were known as kind of an oddity. And then all at once, at least in the higher echelons of government, people started to see us as the Church of Jesus Christ that sent aid to Muslim earthquake victims, to tsunami victims. I mean, we've done this for decades, and so now they're up to about 70 or 80 foreign missionaries, which is amazing.
That's awesome.
That, and it's
in a Muslim majority country.
Yeah.
Wow.
But and so we're doing well, and we now have 2 stakes and a district, and I wrote it down, 24 units, about 7,500 members. But it's still hard. They want to build a church, and to get a church built in Indonesia for any denomination, you've got to have, I think, 60 neighbors sign on to it.
Wow.
And it's almost impossible because Christians don't live in nice, neat little neighborhoods. They're scattered everywhere. So you go to the neighborhood and say, can we build a Christian church here? And they go, no.
Wow.
So we've got wards meeting in what are called shop houses. It's kind of like a shopping mall, but the bottom layer is supposed to be business. The top 2 layers are your home, and they go in and outfit that to be with a chapel and a cultural hall and a baptismal font. Other cities, they get permission, and we've got nice big stake centers. But it's really capricious. You never know, what's going to happen. And just the other day, I was talking to a student in one of my classes who ran afoul of some Muslims. And, 2 years ago, I was in Surakarta. I took my son over, and we helped teach English at a stake English youth conference kind of thing, and talked to one of the missionaries there, and he said they still had a map in Surakarta of these areas don't go to. Don't ride your bike. They're kind of radical Islamic neighborhoods, and missionaries have had problems there. Most 90% of the neighborhoods, no problem, but
Yeah.
you still have to be cautious. And the missionaries, they still can't go door to door. And they know, if you meet somebody from Aceh, you say, "Good to meet you. We're missionaries," but you don't really push anything. You kind of have to read who they are.
Yeah.
And some Muslims are more than willing, and if they invite you, fine. But you really don't. You just always have to be careful and know where you are. And
it makes sense. I mean, my brief experiences of the church in Istanbul, very similar. In and out, missionaries being forced in and out of the city or of the country, depending on what's going on. And I mean, I would go to lessons with them, and they were called volunteers,
right,
or service volunteers or church volunteers, and they would have the lessons in a Starbucks.
Oh,
my favorite one that I went to was a Starbucks with a huge balcony, and it overlooked the Hagia Sophia.
Oh,
and I was just, man, this is so like, holy smokes! Like, we're talking about the gospel in a country that just set out new missionaries, and we can see this momentum. I mean, this world landmark. Just in the distance there, across the water. It was so cool. So I imagine, I mean, obviously no Hagia Sophia in Indonesia, but you have your own Hagia Sophias. You have your own culture. I'm sure it just felt momentous. I mean, this euphoric to be there, to do that.
Well, and you're sitting in sacrament meeting all at once, the call to prayer.
Yeah.
It's, and I loved, after my mission in Indonesia, I'd go to the Middle East and I'd hear the call to prayer, and it was like, it's a fondness, that it brings back memories of a good place and good people. And that's one of the things that I've really appreciated is just, I knew nothing about Islam when I went to Indonesia. I'd never heard the call to prayer. People would ask me, what does your church think about Muhammad? And prior to that, it was before the first president.
Statement.
There's no statement. I was in 1978 about Muhammad receiving truth from God. But over time, over that 2 years, I found so many common beliefs and you would learn as a missionary, to use those to say, oh yeah, well, we too abstain from alcohol, or we too are faithful to our spouse, or we too fast and read scriptures and give alms to the poor. And, Muslims, and then I go to the Middle East, and what I learned in Indonesia, I tell Muslims, it usually starts out with, I can't drink coffee. And then, what else do you believe? And I say it, and then all of us will say, wow, you should become a Muslim, because I'm just doing everything that they would do. So
that was definitely a great time. Come in my home, and you're like, okay, I'll come in your house. And then you start saying no to tea and coffee, and you go, oh, you should be a Muslim. Well, not to the tea and coffee, but to the alcohol.
The alcohol, And then, I read scriptures, I fast, and they're just going, whoa.
Yeah. And there's definitely a great sense of respect. At least my experience with Muslims is there's if you are religious, they go, oh, well, we are too. I mean, we are brothers. Just because you are a devout religious person. That tends to go a long way, I think, when you have that. So we have a youth, a gentleman in my ward, in our local congregation, who's about to go to Singapore. He actually may already be there. And I desperately try to find my copy of the World Religions, an LDS Perspective. And I try to get it, the James Toronto's version of Islam, because he's going to go into the MTC, and he's probably going to be taught almost nothing.
They're not taught.
Almost nothing about Islam. And it's like, holy smokes, the power that you could have going in right from the beginning. I mean, there's something about baptism by fire, right? Learning the hard way, learning how it goes. But I mean, the basics of it, and just go, yeah, absolutely. Here are the 5 pillars. I mean, again, on my mission in Seattle, I took a semester of Arabic. And they go, well, what are the 5 pillars of Islam? And I finally had to learn it. I'm like, oh gosh.
You hadn't had my geography class.
Which, by the way, every single BYU class
I know. That's
teaches that. So I love it. Well, it's like the first week or two is the basics of Islam.
The Mesa majors dislike that, but then the geography majors
Love
never
it.
learned it, so I need to
Exactly.
teach it. I
Exactly.
remember teaching one man. He was a Muslim, and he invited us there. And back in the days of flip charts, and we're doing the restoration, and you're doing the first vision of God the Father and Jesus Christ, and then the angel Moroni, and then Peter, James, and John, the apostles. And finally, this man, this good Muslim, just says, "Stop. You're blaspheming. You know, you're showing me images of deity."
Oh, yeah.
And I had no idea that I was being offensive to him. I had no idea that would, and I never had any other Muslim in Indonesia comment about that.
Interesting.
But he was religious enough that he just said, "You're showing me an image of God and of the prophet Jesus." And
Yeah.
and I don't know if that's something you need to teach in the MTC, but
Yeah.
but I think that is kind of a nice thing to know that that they don't want to be accused of idolatry, and so they don't
Right.
show images. And to know that, I think I could have been a little bit more respectful to them, and maybe not
Yeah.
have used the flip chart. But
Yeah. Or ask if it's okay.
yeah, is it okay if I show you
You know,
some images?
Are you comfortable with that?
Yeah.
I understand, and I understand that your religion does teach this, or we do have a way of teaching our beliefs to you. Are you okay if I use this?
Yeah.
I think that would go a long way.
Yeah.
I think that would be helpful. I'm super excited for that gentleman to go because this is gonna sound really bad, but not bad, but I really wanted to help see a Muslim convert, be part of the process, see them be baptized in Seattle. And it seemed like all the other missionaries that I thought were goofballs were the ones that actually did it.
Oh, really?
And I was the one that couldn't do it.
Yeah.
It's like, come on! I even got a badge in Arabic.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Oh.
it was great. But to me, I mean, I want the respect for their religion is high for me. Especially those that live I guess in today's terms, a more moderate, open-minded, not extreme. It's so powerful, I think, of how similar it is, because and I think that's my favorite thing, is that God is not the God of just the LDS Church.
Right.
He's there. Dan Peterson said this in one class: it's a chessboard. We only see few of the pieces. The chessboard's way bigger. There are more pieces still in the game.
Yeah.
And I think that's my favorite part about studying other religions and other cultures, and another reason why I like the geography class is because geography is not just terrain, right?
Right.
It's political, cultural geography, resource geography. I mean, there's so much more to just, well, there's a mountain range over here, there's a river here, and it's I think it just shows that God's love is infinite for everyone, in all forms and shapes and sizes of each of us in this world. And so I'm really jealous of people like you and this young man that's going to Singapore. I'm glad I went to Seattle, but I really wish I had gone to a country like that. And so what would you, I mean, you're working on this book. We actually, I don't think I mentioned that, but you're working on I think you called it a manuscript.
Yeah.
Is that the
Right,
correct terminology for a professor?
Yeah, I've got hundreds of pages written, but still more to go.
Okay. So you said you're about halfway through. We kind of were talking about, well, what are you going to call it? You're like, well, we got to be careful with the term Mormon, because we're asked to not use it. And you clarified, I've actually never heard this, that it's okay to say Mormon, I guess, in the historical sense. But I mean, it's you are focusing on the individuals.
Yeah. I have a lot of I've interviewed over 100 members and a lot of mission presidents, and people like Maxine Grimm. I first started in 2000, and I was inspired by Lanny Britcht, a professor of Asian history at BYU, who wrote a book about early missionaries in India in the 1850s, and he called it None More Heroic or Nothing More Heroic, because they went and taught but didn't have much success. And I remember listening to him, and I just thought, man, why do you have to wait 150 years to write a history? And I started, and I've interviewed people, and a lot of them have now passed away, and yet I was able to talk to Maxine Grimm, and I was able to talk to a lot of other early members who are now no longer with us, and but it's also hard because some of them are still living, and it's hard to write about somebody current.
Yeah.
Still working on that.
Yeah.
But um,
But you got to get their stories while they're still
right,
alive. So
right,
it's not a child or a journal or
right,
hearsay.
right. And I was going and so a lot of the stories early on, in particular, are a mother of 6 kids who has a vision of somebody in a white robe coming to her and inviting her into a hillside where there's light and offering her a book. And a few weeks later, the elders stop by and are showing her the picture of Moroni visiting
Wow.
Joseph Smith. And she says, that's the guy. And she
Wow.
gets baptized. Her husband gets baptized. They were kind of nominal Muslims, not very devout, but
Yeah.
all 6 of their kids then later served missions during
Wow.
that time period. And but there are a lot of I've got a lot of conversion stories or from missionaries of just teaching and what and a lot of visions and a lot of dreams earlier on, which is
Interesting.
surprising because that's not something I don't think you hear as much about.
No.
Maybe people
No.
don't share it, but
Well, that's actually a question that I do want to ask you. I guess I might as well ask. So, again, referencing my mission, we had a guy from Sudan who had a dream of the angel Moroni on top of a temple. And when you come to see, much like many other temples around the world, it's like you turn a road or get on the highway and you go up a hill and you go, bam, there's the temple. The Seattle temple's a little bit more hidden because the trees have grown on the edges of it. And it's located in Bellevue, and so he's going down, and you have to almost, I mean, you can still see it, but while you're driving, you kind of have to be right next to it to see it. So he's driving, he gets right there, and he goes, oh, "I've seen that golden, well, not knowing it was an angel,
Right.
but I've seen that golden figure in a dream." And I mean, he was a golden, a perfect convert, someone easy to teach. Said yes, I totally get it. And so that was very rare, I would agree. But do you think, I mean, part of me thinks sometimes people make up things. Sometimes people, now this is kind of getting into the not just Indonesia, but sometimes people just say like, oh, I had this experience, just to kind of make it up or to be like, to feel special about it. And maybe in the moment they believed it.
yeah,
And vice versa, like, well, we kind of were joining the church culture. Like, oh, I joined because of the Osmonds or my sponsors to the U.S. As a refugee were LDS, so I joined the church. And so you just mentioned that not majority, but a lot of people were having these dreams or visions of sorts. How much of that do you feel like is a cultural experience? Because maybe culturally you have revelatory dreams about God, or how much of them do you think were actually true, sincere experiences?
I mean, I think there are people who do kind of have, I know people who have dreams that they think are very real, and I've never had a dream direct me anywhere, and or people I remember, or people who just the spirit guides them much more intimately than I experience. But in interviewing these people, and I'm sitting there and it was interesting because I would just kind of say, tell me about you, tell me about your church, and BYU, the IRB, they wanted to, what questions are you going to ask?
What's the IRB?
That's the
interview research basic questions.
Yeah, it's to make sure that you don't abuse people in experiments and things.
Right. It's like a human, like you have to do that.
Yeah,
anything that involves human. Yeah.
But so I applied for that, and they were saying, well, we want to see all your questions. I go, my questions are just open ended. I just start out and I never know where it's going to go. Kind of like tonight, and so I'd just be going along, and then they say, how'd you join the church? And they would tell me this, and all the ones I'm thinking of, it was a very real thing to them. It was very moving. I mean, my sense was they were telling the truth, but I don't know them well enough to know that. Did they do this? Has this been something else that, were they told in a dream to have 6 kids or to marry this man? But I took it at face value as just wow, and wondered if that was maybe necessary for people, particularly who are coming in from a maybe more questionable, from a religion where it's harder to make the move. That they needed something more visual than maybe just a burning in the bosom,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
but maybe that was part of what was necessary then to.
It
Yeah,
wouldn't have been an easy conversion.
yeah,
I mean, even if you were going, well, I'm doing it because my buddy's doing it.
hmm,
It's not so much an easy conversion. I mean, early Latter-day Saints in the UK and much of Europe joined. Well, my pastor's joining, so
yeah,
I'm going to come with him. Now, that wasn't always the case, but that there are stories of the pastor of this church join, and so the rest of the congregation just joined like
right,
that.
right, yeah,
And in fact, many of those people were staunch, strong members of the church. It just was, I think, it was just a different time too. It's hard to see what that meant back then,
right.
and what it was like for them for the quote unquote early Latter-day Saints. Now, in this case, these are the quote unquote early Latter-day Saints in
Right.
Indonesia.
Oh, they were referred to as pioneers in
Yeah.
Indonesia. Yeah, yeah.
That's awesome. And
Yeah.
so I think you're right. You mentioned this earlier. Like, there's this kind of this, this special experience that these
Yeah.
people have. And I guess I asked that question earlier is because, sometimes you just go, how much of it's a cultural change versus or pressure change, or because you say that people join that if they get married and so they
Right.
convert into that religion because of marriage.
And a lot of them joined just because they love these foreign elders who are young and,
Mm-hmm.
and friendly, and I think we're converted more to the
Social
the
aspect.
social aspect. And,
Yeah.
but it's interesting because Indonesia, where Christians are a minority, and then you become a Latter-day Saint, and then you're even more of a minority.
Yeah.
And they just 2 weeks ago they had this big 50th anniversary celebration, went on for 3 hours, and they had singing and dancing, and it was amazing. It's on YouTube, and I watched it, and it's amazing to watch this. I'm going to call it a Mormon community where they now see themselves as a distinct group, and that's very impressive. But it's caused challenges, and so one of this elder Subandrio, when he was, I don't know if it was when he was mission president, but on Christmas Day, all the Christian communities go to their church to celebrate and to have a service, and that's who they hang out with, because more likely than not, they may be the only Christian in their family.
Yeah.
Or they may have Muslim relatives, and there's not a nuclear family. Well, there's not an extended family to celebrate with, and so Subandrio asked in Hong Kong. He said, "Can we have a Christmas Day service?"
Yeah.
And the response was, "Well, we don't do that." I think he tried to explain it, but the explanation should have been, but that's how Mormons see themselves, and that's how Christians see themselves in an Islamic country, is your family sometimes is your congregation.
Yeah.
And they really do sometimes, that 20 years they really felt isolated because the church didn't want to draw attention to the fact that we were there with local missionaries. And so when Subandrio was called to be a mission president, they didn't even put his picture in the church news.
Wow.
Because they didn't want to say, we've now got an Indonesian mission president serving in Indonesia. So the church of Salt Lake is, being extra cautious. And then they're also kind of applying, well, Christmas is for families. Christmas is to be at home, but in Indonesia, Christmas is to be with your fellow Christians. And so he I don't know if I should say this, but I'll say it. He then, on his own, said, well, I don't know what his role in it was, but that member of that branch at the time went off and had a Christmas camp out.
Oh, wow.
Went out into the woods of Indonesia and had a church outing for Christmas, because, it's hot and it's, there's not anything to do at home. But he just thought, these guys need to be together. And so he kind of said, well, we're going to mix it up a little bit.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Christmas is definitely very different, even from country to country compared. I mean, here in the U.S. or Western countries, typically, I found out Scotland didn't take off Christmas Day of work until I think the 60s or 70s.
Oh, really? Wow.
So I mean, it was just another day. I'm sure they gave a small gift or something like that, but we've definitely commercialized it here in the U.S. But that's interesting. I mean, you gotta get together with what you can, and you gotta strengthen each other.
Yeah.
It's that great analogy of burning sticks, right? I mean, if you have a whole pile of sticks or logs that you've put into the fire, and you pull one out, that's definitely on fire, but it's going to go out way faster
Yeah.
than if it were to stay in that
Yeah.
fire.
Yeah.
And so if you stick together, you're going to be able, no pun intended. If you
Yeah.
stick together, you're going to be able to keep that fire going. In this case, the faith going and the encouragement for each other. Um, well, by no means I didn't mean to belittle anyone's testimony of
No,
converting.
no.
Because I have no doubt, especially early saints, pioneers, definitely have these miraculous experiences to again build that foundation. So what do you see? What do you see for the future of Indonesia?
They're I mean, they're hoping for a temple, and they always get right kind of to the maybe we've got enough priesthood holders, enough tithe payers, enough members, and truthfully, I listen every conference, and when they announce a second or a third temple for Utah County, I go, what?
No.
You know, or even what was the one last time? I I mean, I understand they're not quite there, but they are so faithful, and
They would use it.
they would use it, and they now go mainly to Manila or Hong Kong. I know when they did Papua New Guinea, my wife says, "Oh, that's close," but airline connections between Jakarta and Papua New Guinea, it's a lot easier to go to Manila or Hong Kong.
Yeah.
But the members are. I saw a Facebook post from an Indonesian the other day asking, when are we going to get our temple? And actually 2 years ago, one of the current patriarch of the Jakarta stake had mentioned that there were people that are looking at property, and I think it's hard just to figure out where do we put it, because Jakarta is so crowded, but that's where most of the members are. How do we get approval? Because now we've got to get the local community to sign on, 60 things, and they say, well, we're going to build this big Christian edifice, and they're going, not in our Muslim neighborhood.
Yes.
So I think the statement of having the first temple in an Islamic country, I don't know if the church is quite willing to own or quite willing to make that statement, because then it says to the rest of the Islamic world,
we're coming.
Yeah, we're coming. And yet that's kind of, how I see, well, Indonesia sees itself as we can be a bridge to the Islamic world. And I think President Packer has talked about that. His friendship with President Wahid was, he saw it very much as this is the beginning of a toehold in a good way, I think, but it's a way for us to better understand Muslims and interact with them and help them and learn from them. And so I think a temple, I don't know what the thinking is, but there are enough Latter-day Saints there compared to, some Cambodia now has one, Thailand, they've got more members, but
Thailand's getting a temple.
Yeah,
It's interesting that you say that, because that's exactly the same current words in Istanbul, in Turkey. The branch president in Istanbul, President Chequers, we're here to build a temple. We're here for a temple. And when they sent the first missionaries, it's been a while. Elder Christofferson, I think, is the first 5 missionaries in the MTC to learn Turkish. And Elder Christofferson, I think it's Christofferson, anyway, went to their room before he gave his Tuesday night devotional and said, well, first off, they were in line waiting for him. He goes, where are they? And the teachers go, I'll go get them. And they said the same thing, like, we believe that Turkey's going to be a branch into helping the church get more solidity in Muslim countries, mostly the Middle East, because it's geographically so close. But holy smokes, I mean, Indonesia, you've got 7,000, you said? I mean, they're I shouldn't say way, but they're definitely way ahead of Turkey. And I think it makes sense. I mean, it's can the church survive in a Islamic majority? I don't want to say Islamic state, but Islamic majority country.
And I think it's proven it has. Particularly that government officials now know who we are. We've got big churches with the name in a lot of the cities. One of the members in Bogor, a female member, is a member of the city council of this big city, and I mean they're good. They've proven that they're good citizens. They're loyal citizens. They're
no harm.
And we abide by the rules too. We're not sneaking around. went those 20 years without missionaries. We didn't slip Bibles into our aid relief to
Yeah.
Aceh like other Christian groups did.
Yeah.
So I think it'll go forward. But one thing that is, I don't know if it's frustrating, but I always ask, why don't you look at East Malaysia, part of the Singapore mission, is booming. The northern Borneo
With missionary work.
missionary work and branches and churches, and just across the border, you've got the same ethnic people, Dayaks and Iban, who are primarily non-Muslim and are many of them Christian, many of them converting in Malaysia. And I've asked leaders in Indonesia, why don't we have missionaries in Borneo, in the Indonesian half of Borneo, where there's proof that
It's
there
the
are
same
people
culture,
ready,
at
the
least,
same
yeah.
culture, and they always come back with centers of strength, and those are in the big cities of Java, which are primarily Muslim, and we have two outlying branches in Sumatra and Sulawesi in historic Christian areas,
Yeah.
but otherwise they're all on Bali or all on Java, and it's partly because they're limited in the number of missionaries. They just don't have enough missionaries to staff the 24 current units
Yeah.
and expand out. And they also, I think, there's just this fear of, can we sustain it?
Yeah.
But in Malaysia they sustain it, but that's kind of their main area. That's where they're having all the success. So it's slow going, but there's always been this hope amongst missionaries that one day they will be the ones to open up a new island, and
Yeah.
and go in and be the ones that are, you
Yeah.
know. And my son in Ghana is in a new little village that has just had missionaries for 8 months, and they're a dependent group. And he writes home, and I go, "Oh man, that sounds like, Indonesia 45 years ago."
That's
And,
awesome.
and Ghana's really grown, but he's in a new area, and I think every missionary wishes that they could be the one to go into a new area. And I've traveled to a dozen islands in Indonesia, and some of them very Christian, like Flores and Sumba and Northern Sulawesi, and we're just not there.
Yeah.
They could have, Indonesia is double the size of the Philippines that has, I think, maybe 22 missions. I mean, Indonesia,
Wow.
numbers wise, could have a dozen
yeah.
missions
Yeah.
if we could get the visas.
Yeah.
But we're not a Catholic majority country.
Yeah.
Thank the Spanish for colonizing
Yeah.
the Philippines. But,
Yep, that's for sure. The colonization. There's definitely a lot of bad things,
Right,
but at
right,
least we can thank the stepping stone of
Right.
Christianity.
well, I teach my students that 700,000 Latter-day Saints in the Philippines versus 7,000 in Indonesia. And it's been in the Philippines 10 years longer, but
Wow.
it's a lot easier to teach a Catholic
Yeah.
than it is a Muslim.
Yeah, I definitely agree. So President Nelson is showing up to Indonesia November 22nd.
Yeah.
Is he gonna miss Thanksgiving?
No, it's the week before Thanksgiving.
Okay, but I mean, I
Yeah.
don't know how long.
It's the last.
Sorry, my mind goes to Thanksgiving.
It's the last day of his Southeast Asia tour. I think he's
okay.
already over there, but
Wow.
it's a Friday night, a week from this Friday, and they're all descending on Jakarta. When President Hinckley went, that was the first prophet to visit Indonesia. President Hinckley had gone when I was a missionary as an apostle. Elder Nelson has gone as an apostle, but this will be the second church president to go to Indonesia.
Wow.
And he was there, I think, just a year and a half ago. But it's a rare, it doesn't happen very often.
Right. Yeah. It seems like my experience, and maybe it's because I've got more connections with places outside of the church. Sorry, with the church outside of the U.S. It seems like the apostles are traveling quite a bit.
I think so. Yeah.
Quite a bit more than we used to, or at least again, maybe I'm just got more grounds
I think so.
on the.
I would,
Yeah, it seems to be way more often, which is really exciting. Really, really exciting to see the general authorities be part of it. I mean, also it's extremely easier to travel to places like Indonesia. But I'm excited. I hope that. I know it'll make a huge impact for those members there, for the missionaries. It's President Nelson has this weird thing of all right, we're gonna do it. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
like it wasn't possible. We're gonna do it. So who
We're gonna
knows?
make it happen.
Maybe this trip will help inspire.
And maybe this trip he'll start announcing temples in local conferences. That would
Oh
be a fun
wow,
thing if
that
he
would be fun.
announced it there on that Friday night. But I don't know.
Oh, that
Because he
would be
kind of
really
bucks,
cool.
usually just for conference, but
Yeah.
that would really be fun to see.
And a shame that you're not
Yeah,
there
no, not there. Yeah,
if he did do that.
yeah,
But that would be really amazing to see.
yeah,
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if President Nelson's the person that starts doing that.
yeah.
That starts, we're going to announce it in the area that it is.
And I think it helps that he's been there already, and I think and knows the members, and doesn't have perhaps this hesitancy or this caution or fear
Yeah.
of
Yes.
oh no that. And I think that's President Hinckley had that same familiarity with Asia, and I think he was more willing to, and because he had already been to Indonesia once before, then when church security is saying don't go, he says, well, let me rethink this
Yeah.
and let me get some other input, and I think that really is engaging with Islam in general or with a country like Indonesia. The more you know about them, the more people you've met, the less. I think the more open you are,
Yeah.
it's not a fearful thing. And when I tell people, I'm going to Indonesia, and they go, oh no, are you going to be safe? And I go, yeah, I'll be safe.
We'll be fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have zero hesitation to go to the Middle East.
Yeah.
Zero.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't go to where ISIS is.
Right.
but
And things happen, but
Yeah.
it's not like you have a target on your back. And
yeah.
I mean, Arabs.
They think you're German anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
They
'Cause they
always-
always travel.
yeah.
Yeah. But Muslims in general are very hospitable. I mean,
Yes.
if Arabs or Indonesian Muslims, wherever you go, they're very open. I
Yeah.
think. Yeah.
Well, it definitely seems like there needs to be a little bit more of a cultural shift to help with the buildings in regards to the Muslims in Indonesia. And I feel like generally there needs to be a cultural shift when it comes to other religions towards the LDS Church.
Yeah.
And I think it's happening in some areas, in some areas it's not. And unfortunately, I think, again, referring back to Turkey, I mean, culturally, it's kind of gone reverse.
Yeah. I'd say the same in Indonesia.
Yeah, it seems like things like ISIS and political leaders are coming in and saying, you know what, maybe we need to be a little bit more stricter, or not, you know what, but rather it's time to be a little bit more strict.
Right. Well, and after the Aceh tsunami, a lot of Acehnese were saying this is God's punishment for not being devout enough. I mean, there was that sense that it was a punishment, and I think there is a sense of global Islam that. Maybe Islam is the solution to our political troubles or our economic woes. That, there's just this, nothing else has seemed to work. And maybe, and especially when Islamic organizations come in and start helping, and that, just a side note on that, the LDS Church is almost always partnered with Islamic Relief.
Yes.
We've been,
I've worked with them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been amazing in Indonesia to see Muslims and Mormons working together on this aid. So
that's pretty. And I think, to me, as a Latter-day Saints, it feels powerful.
Yeah.
To be working with not just LDS Charities, but with another organization, and to build bridges one-on-one with those people.
Yeah.
Well, I'm excited. I think. I've always had a special place for missionaries outside. As much as I served in the stateside, I love missionaries that have served in those countries that are just minorities. Lauren here's got red hair. She sticks out like a sore thumb. In Korea, it's different. It's a different experience, and learning a language that's not even close to English. But then you also get to be part of that pioneer experience. I think it's amazing. So,
it changed my life. I mean, learning Indonesia, I then became interested in Arabic words and in Islam, and so I came back and I took 1 quarter of Arabic at Utah State. Then when I came to BYU for my master's degree, I said I want to learn about Islam, I want to learn Arabic. I then mainly studied the Middle East, but it was really kind of my mission in an Islamic country that opened my eyes, and so my whole career has been one of, my dissertation was on Christian-Muslim relations in Nazareth, and I've just always wanted to find a way to build bridges and to acknowledge the common
Yeah.
beliefs that we have, the common values that we have, the common desires to be with your family and eat
Yep.
good food and
Yep.
just live life and enjoy
Yep.
life. So
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's a great way to maybe send us off is, the purpose what your purpose has been in this. I mean, 27 years at BYU plus everything else that you've done in this area. It sounds like, I mean, it's to really build those bridges.
yeah,
And you definitely are a bridge builder. I mean, as soon as I posted about this, our a friend that's Muslim at BYU says, "Oh, he's the kindest man." I don't know if you saw that.
I saw that. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
Mutaz,
Motaz. I mean, he honestly has a lot of respect for the LDS religion, being a Muslim going to BYU.
He's Jordanian, isn't he?
Yes, Jordanian, yeah. And he's such a good guy. He was my side note. He was my when I was taking Arabic, he was speaking teacher one-on-one. I forget what we call him, but I'd go to him and practice one-on-one with a partner with him, and man, he was so brutal. And
otherwise he's a very nice guy.
He was a great guy.
Yeah.
And it's great to see. I'm sure it was his first year
Yeah.
I think in the States alone, and being at BYU, I think he was just like, Americans are dumb. But he's a great guy, and he has a lot of admiration for you. And I know many other people have great admiration for you. You're definitely a man of the people. You care about the individuals, not just outside of the U.S., but here in the U.S., you definitely care. And people see that. So if you haven't heard that, your students love you. Obviously, a connection here. I've appreciated just that one class. Yeah. It's only one class, and it made a big impact on me. So thank you for that. Excited for your book. Do you have an ETA on that?
No, but I've got a sabbatical next year, so next summer and next fall, I'm hoping to bang it out, and this summer. So yeah.
Okay, well, we'll look for it.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks for having me. It's good to visit with you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank
Letting
you.
me tell stories. I love telling stories.
We'll have to have you on again.
Okay, sounds good.
Thanks.
Thanks, Scott.
Shop top, shop it,